All of us have been hurt in our lives, but have all of us experienced damage? Today's topic is psychological trauma and how there is hope for those who are survivors. This is The Paul Martin Show. Well, welcome. I'm Paul Martin. I have spent a career studying suffering from a spiritual, physical, and emotional standpoint. I've done that vocationally as a humanitarian and also in my formal studies in philosophy with a focus on ethics. And the purpose of this show is to help people improve their lives through what I call fighting the order of ignorance and injustice in the world. There's a lot of ignorance and there's most certainly a lot of injustice. This is a show to help inform and to help make your relationships and hopefully even this world a better place. So, trauma is a popular word today, and I want to just give, I think, some vital information just about the history of trauma, number one, if you will. For many centuries, we didn't want to even name trauma. For example, in the late 1800s in France, trauma was studied. In fact, specifically, women who suffered from what they called hysteria, women who were locked up, were studied. Doctors wanted to know what was wrong with them. Seems rather sexist, perhaps, in certain ways, but they wanted to know what was wrong. And what they found in their research overwhelmingly was that these women had been raped, abused, there had been incest in their families. It was concluded overwhelmingly that the reason for their hysteria, if you will, was because they were survivors of sexual, spiritual, physical abuse. But at that time, there was no political or social underpinning. There was no movement. The government didn't care about this. And Freud himself literally walked away from his research knowing full well that there was nothing they could do about it. Fast forward to World War I. We have soldiers coming back from in the trenches combat, and some of them come back mute. Their trauma is so severe that they're unable to even speak. So, what does our government do? There's no diagnosis. We literally shock their necks. We try to basically say to these soldiers, suck it up. We're going to torture you to get you to speak. So backwards were our views on trauma that we actually re-traumatized our soldiers because we didn't even have a word. We called it shell shock or battle fatigue. And by the 1960s, the Vietnam War happens. You have more protests. People are more outspoken. And thank God for the feminist revolution of the late 60s and early 70s, because then women started speaking out. They started speaking out about domestic violence. They started naming not just the violence itself, but the symptoms. And suddenly you have this movement, this kind of political, social movement to say that the effects of trauma could be devastating. The second point, which is the most crucial point I'm going to make in this video, is this. We tend to think of mental issues as purely psychological. This is a big problem today, huge problem today. Mind over matter, suck it up, get over it, right? You've all heard it before. But with trauma, it's different. Trauma is actually not a psychological disorder. Trauma is physical. Our brain is an organ. We have kidneys, we have liver, we have organs. Our brain is an organ. And trauma, psychological trauma is actually a physical, something went wrong in the brain because of radical stress. So here's an image. So when somebody scrapes their arm, right, we don't tell them to get over it or somehow assume that they could wish it away. There is a physical event that happens on the arm, and trauma in the same way is a physical event that happens in the brain. So trauma, number one, has been around obviously for a long time, but only in the last few decades we've started naming it. And secondly, psychological trauma is purely physical. Now, I want to make an important distinction because all of us have been hurt in our lives. I mean, when we came out of our mother's womb, we cried because the passage wasn't necessarily comfortable, right? So life for all of us from the time we were born is riddled with hurt. Being made fun of at school, or chronic criticism, or a loss of job or a business, a divorce from our parents, legal trouble, loss of valuables, all right? So hurt is common, but we are not talking about hurt. When we talk about psychological trauma, I am not talking about merely painful emotional events. We all deal with those. But there's a distinction, and I want to make this distinction clear between hurt and damage. So we sometimes say small t trauma to refer to hurt and large T trauma to refer to other things that are far more damaging, and that is child abuse, child neglect, child abandonment, incest, bullying, sexual harassment, rape, combat, war, persecution, near death experiences, a major car accident, for example, terminal illness, witnessing a crime such as a mass shooting. So, two categories to keep things simple: hurt, which is hard, and in many times we're strengthened from; damage, which is hard and we are set back by. It actually affects our brain. That is what we're talking about when we're talking about trauma. So, what is big T trauma then? So, what more, like from a definitional point of view, what is it? In psychological trauma or emotional trauma is physical damage or injury to the brain after living through an extremely frightening or distressing event or events. Trauma fuses together the memories of the traumatic event to distressing emotions. The event and the emotions become one in the psyche. And we all know that. Those of us that can remember, perhaps, from childhood, a really difficult moment, it actually brings us stress. So you have the memory, but you actually have the pain linked together. And then finally, trauma is a brain event. And I want to quickly say to those of you watching, it would be really helpful if you would just click the subscribe button, click the like button, make a comment. It actually helps me in this program. YouTube likes that. So I would greatly appreciate that. Think, if you will, of if you got your car, you put it in park, and you just stepped on the gas as hard as you could, and your gas tank was full, right? There is stress put on that engine. And that stress on the engine is eventually going to result in the engine breaking down. So this is a metaphor I want to use. There are events in our lives that can be so overwhelming to our brains that there's a physical reaction in our brain that actually becomes permanent, no different than the car, the engine that breaks down. And so you have a brain, in a sense, that is broken. And that is what we're talking about today. So what are the symptoms then of big T trauma, of damage that's happened? What do survivors of big T trauma deal with? And you're going to guess probably many of these. And this is just a short list: shame, guilt, fear, depression, anxiety, panic attacks, irritability, disassociation, hypervigilance, which is just always being on edge that something's going to go wrong, denial, impulsivity, aggression, hopelessness, paranoia, inability to concentrate. And there's a physical reality as well. This is well documented: heart disease, chronic lung disease, diabetes, kidney disease, obesity, liver disease, physical injury, and STDs. And basically, over time, survivors of big T trauma, they lose the ability to make decisions, interact with others, and regulate emotions. These consequences follow people into adulthood. My next episode is going to get to the effects on society. But just for a second, imagine those people who are inmates in high security prisons. Overwhelmingly, we're talking about people who suffered from trauma, capital T trauma, as children. And if you conversely look at children that major from our top universities in the world, overwhelmingly, they did not grow up in homes where they suffered from capital T trauma. That should be very, very clear. So how common is capital T trauma? And if you look at this graph on the left, there are over 100 million Americans who have suffered from trauma. On the left, you see ACE, that stands for Adverse Childhood Experience. There's a test called the ACEs study. It's 10 questions. You answer yes or no. And these are 10 questions about trauma as a child. And so 166 million Americans got one on that test. They had one traumatic experience growing up. You have 41 million Americans who experienced 4 or more traumatic experiences growing up. 21 million Americans, predominantly women, who have been raped. 2 million combat vets, and 91 million people who were bullied as children. And so you have over 100 million. On the right of the screen, you can see that 7 of 10 Americans have experienced one traumatic event in their lifetime. And so trauma, serious emotional trauma, is dominant. It shouldn't be surprising to you. You could be a survivor. If you're not, you most certainly know people that are. Developmental trauma is by far our nation's gravest and greatest health crisis. I've seen it firsthand working as a CEO of an organization that worked in the US and around the world with child victims of emotional abuse, neglect, abandonment, and physical abuse. And so it's prevalent, it's everywhere in the world. And one more time, I'd like to ask you if you could just to like this video or subscribe to it. But now the best part of this video, because there is tremendous hope. And actually 20 or 30 years ago, I would not be saying this. So what is the hope? First off, we have a name for it. Remember earlier I said in the feminist movement, we finally came up with a term, domestic violence. We could name something. And there is power in being able to name things. And so we now have a name. We now have an acronym, this PTSD. There is a reality of post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not shell shock. It's not hysteria. It happens both to men and to women. In the early 90s, there was a groundbreaking book by a woman. She was a Harvard psychiatrist, Judith Herman, and she wrote this book, Trauma and Recovery. And in many ways, she got the momentum going on accepting trauma, speaking of survivors. And at around that time, there was another woman on the West Coast in California named Francine Shapiro. And Shapiro, a psychologist, came up with a way to treat trauma called EMDR. It is an acronym for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a rather mouthful there. But EMDR is the leading treatment for people who have suffered trauma. And EMDR is talk therapy, but it's a way of helping people specifically. And it is endorsed by all the major health agencies in the world. And the statistics and things that people are saying about EMDR are mind-boggling. This brings so much hope. Just a couple of quotes. A leader of UNICEF said, "It is my conviction that the EMDR therapy modality will in due course be held as one of the great health discoveries of our time, in its consequentiality on par with penicillin, the polio vaccine, and oral rehydration." We're talking about something significant. The VA said EMDR is the most powerful tool. This was a leader at the VA I've encountered for treating post-traumatic stress. In the hands of a competent and compassionate therapist, it gives people the means to heal themselves. New York Magazine said EMDR, which to newcomers sounds implausible and way too good to be true, may become the psychological wonder cure of the 90s, the non-pharmaceutical equivalent of Prozac. And so we have hope. We have treatment. There are millions and millions of survivors of trauma walking around in the U.S. today and certainly around the world. It's common. We name it. It's not mind over matter because we're talking about a brain event, but like a broken arm, we're talking about something that could be healed and people who could live good, flourishing lives in the future. Again, I thank you for watching. Do subscribe, and until next time.